we continue our study this morning in 1 Corinthians, we got into chapter 7 last week. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. While you're turning there, next week you remember, actually this week now, Saturday is our lectureship. So I hope that you have that on your calendars and plan to be here. Should be just an outstanding Saturday morning for us. And then Brother Hires has agreed to stay over, so he'll be teaching the class next Sunday morning and also preaching for us. He'll have a different topic. So we'll come back to this in a couple, 3 weeks, I guess, and continue this particular study here in 1 Corinthians. So kind of keep that in mind. I hope that you did some study this week in chapter 7. If you're visiting with us, likely you didn't. But he's talking here about marriage, and we got into our introduction. This was another one of the problems that these folks were facing. And as we talked last week towards the end of our class, you've heard that old statement, and they lived happily ever after. Well, it wasn't true before, and it's not true now. Any good, faithful marriage will have its ups and have its downs. Occasionally somebody will say, we've never had a fuss, or we've never had an argument, we've never had a fight, and somebody says, and they'll lie about other things too. Or maybe we just don't remember, but maybe that has happened somewhere in some rare case. But good marriages are good because they were working through those disagreements and those arguments and came out of it, with a stronger commitment and a stronger dedication. And God, back in Genesis 2, made it plain that it was not good for man to be alone. So he made woman as a companion, as a helpmeet. There was something missing with man, and it was woman. He brought the two together, Genesis 2, 18 through 25. So God performed that first marriage ceremony. He kind of prepared Adam for it by having him to name all of the animals that have been created. And no doubt one of the things that must have been pretty obvious to Adam was that there was no one suitable for him. There was no one like him. And thus God prepared him through that process, it would seem to me, to begin this marriage relationship with the woman that God created or made from man's rib. So man was made from dirt, woman was made from man. So you ladies got a upside there for sure. Paul is going to talk about family and marriage. Basically, he's going to advise them not to get married under the present circumstance. We don't know exactly what was going on here, what the problems were in Corinth. It may just have been persecution. And yet Paul was not opposed to marriage. In fact, he goes on to say that it was the best thing in many circumstances. But evidently there was something going on here that would have made it very difficult for them to begin a marriage at this particular time. If we think about marriage overall, times have changed, problems have evolved, but the attitude towards marriage definitely has changed, not for the better. Today we live in a society where more and more people are living together before marriage. We're also living in a time when more and more people just choose not to get married at all. I guess there's a time limit that legally would pronounce a man husband and wife if they lived together enough years. But attitudes towards that have changed. Attitudes towards divorce have changed. And again, not for the better. God's attitude hasn't changed. Biblical principles have not changed. In fact, in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus goes back to Genesis 2 and basically emphasizes the fact that even though things had been different during the days of Moses, and some things had taken place that were not pleasing to God, things were taking place when Jesus was here upon this earth in the first century that were not pleasing to God. He goes all the way back to Genesis and basically emphasizes the fact one man for one woman for life. And those principles, of course, are not changing and have not changed. That's pretty much, I think, where we had sort of left off last week. And we noted in verse 1 of chapter 7, now concerning the things of which you wrote to me. We noted that the approach now changes. Paul, up to this point, had evidently been discussing questions that had been asked of him by those of Chloe's household back in chapter 1, or maybe others that he had talked to about what was going on in Corinth. But it appears that a letter was written, and Paul seems to approach each of these questions with that expression, now concerning. So there's a series of questions. And here in chapter 7, verses 1 through 40, basically he's going to deal with marriage. The second question had to do with things that were sacrificed to idols. And he'll begin that in chapter 8. And he will deal with that all the way through chapter 11, because this idea of things being sacrificed to idols brought in this idea of how both Jew and Gentile would relate to secular things, how they would relate to special days and even holidays, how that the Jew coming away from that, how the Gentile from another direction. So Paul really expands on this issue in those particular chapters. In chapter 11, beginning verse 2, he's going to talk about worship and some different problems and concerns they were having about worship. Then in chapter 12 and verse 1, the gifts of the Holy Spirit and how that these particular gifts were being abused. They were taking the miraculous ability to speak in different languages, and they had elevated it above the other miraculous gifts. And of course, in the midst of that, you have that great love chapter in chapter 13. So Paul comes back to one of the central themes of the book, and that was unity. You remember we started out with that problem back in chapter 3, where they were choosing up favorite preachers, and they were not united in Jesus Christ. And so he's going to deal with that. He'll deal with the resurrection in chapter 15, beginning in verse 1. So there were some issues about the resurrection and what it would be like and when it would take place. And then his final question had to do with the collection for the poor saints in Jerusalem. Now, there was a famine there at that time. So in chapter 16 and verse 1, he'll deal with that, and then his closing remarks as he finishes up. So the rest of our study, as we've already begun to look at marriage here, will deal with these particular questions. And I think one of the things that's interesting about that is he'll deal with a lot of things that we still have questions today about. So a lot of the questions have not changed. Some of these issues were particularly affecting these folks because of the culture and because of the situation in which they were in. And one of the things that we've noted here in this particular chapter, when we deal with marriage, the immorality in Corinth, was so bad that it sounds like, as Paul jumps into this, that some of the Christians were urging the single life as the only safe way not to sin in this particular environment. The temple that was there with as many as 1,000 prostitutes and all of that was done as an act of worship to their particular god. That just tells you a little bit about what was taking place in the community. And now you have the church established, so you've got this little shining light of purity and morality and goodness in the midst of this very, very wicked, immoral, liberal thinking and almost everything society. So the struggle was definitely there. Some have understood again that Paul here was maybe despairing or putting down this idea of mercy, of marriage rather. But that's really not what he was doing. He was simply pointing out that there was nothing wrong with celibacy. Paul even points out that on down in verse 7 that's the life that he'd chosen for himself. He'd chosen not to marry. But over against that argument, he also points out that marriage was the very best thing for a lot of folks. But the problems, and I guess it would be nice if we knew more about what particular problem they were having that Paul is talking about here. He really doesn't expand on why he thought under the circumstance in Corinth that it would be better for them not to marry. Maybe it was just the fact that sexual sin was so commonplace and the temptations for an unmarried adult would have been tremendous. And thus maybe he was emphasizing the fact that it was better in those cases to get married. On the flip side, he was talking about the obligations and the responsibilities that husband and wives would have for each other, and that would be a difficult challenge for them as well. But he grants that the norm was for people to get married, and that there was a responsibility for husbands and wives to meet the sexual needs and the sexual responsibilities for each other. And he recognizes that as well. He also talks about the fact that there were responsibilities to one another. He deals with this in verses 3 and 4. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. And then in verse 4, we figure out exactly what he's talking about, because he's talking about the sexual relationship. And basically is saying that in a marriage, if a sexual relationship is withheld by the husband or by the wife, then it's basically fraud. There is a responsibility there. And in almost a sex-driven society that these folks were living in, where sexual relationships were sought outside of marriages, even in the name of religion, I think we can see how warped some of the attitudes probably were. People growing up in Corinth would probably have not, appreciated at all this idea of a man keeping himself just to his wife sexually, and the wife keeping herself just to the husband sexually. So he deals with that, and basically in verse 5, he's telling them, not to cheat, to keep themselves one to another. And then verse 7, he comes back and says, "But I wish that all were even like myself." But each one has his own gift from God, noting that some could do that. Some could remain unmarried and not have the temptation overcome them. Some could not. And Paul was one of those that was, I might say Paul was so married to the church. He was so committed to Jesus Christ that he seemingly handled this temptation very easily in comparison to maybe temptations that others would not have handled so well. Anybody with a thought there? Some of the wording is pretty interesting. It's like a lot of passages. If you read one verse, you might wonder what in the world he's talking about. If you back up or continue on, lots of times it begins to make a little more sense here. Basically, that the two would basically be in agreement if they, separated, for example, sexually, that it had to be both of them wanting to do that. Sex sometimes has been used as a bargaining point, and that should not be in a marriage. If you don't do this, I won't do that type of a situation. But he's basically saying that they both need to be on the same page here in reference to that particular idea. Anybody else? Her question had to do with the word consent there in verse 5. Okay. He kind of concludes, I think, that thought in verses 8 and 9. Verse 9 particularly, but they cannot exercise, if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. So emphasizing the fact that sexual desires are very common for mankind. God gave us those. So we know that those are good, and yet the fulfilling of those desires needs to be carried out in the marriage relationship. And Paul is simply noting here that marriage is the place to do that, and with most folks that's where we need to be because of the temptation that is there. Fornication, the adultery, those types of things obviously will cause us to lose our souls, and we need to do everything that we can to avoid that temptation and to keep ourselves faithful in our marriages. Yes? Well, there were, that's, you go all the way back to Adam and Eve, and brings up this thought. Who did Cain and Abel marry? Well, it had to have been sisters. We know that there were other children there. So obviously, at least for those first few years, it was within one family. Later, we find that God sets forth the principle of not marrying close relatives, and that became an issue there. And of course, the sad effect of that with birth defects and those types of things. But later, within Israel, they were commanded to make sure that they stayed within those 12 tribes. Of course, that was hundreds of years later. I think very, very early there were warnings against marrying those that were unbelievers, marrying those that were caught up in idolatry. And we find those warnings, not that it was a sin to marry someone that was not a Christian, but that obviously that was not something that was wise. But he does give some advice, at least, along those lines. And that may not come close to answering your question. Anybody else have a comment on that idea? And there was a period of time, obviously, when men were taking more than one wife. I think that's why in Matthew 19, those first 9 verses where Jesus was dealing with some of those issues, he goes all the way back to Genesis 2 and shows that God's intention to begin with was one man, one woman for life. And yet he also notes that if a person dies, then obviously that person is freed from that. We'll get into some of that here in this chapter, to be free from that law to contact another marriage. Later, as you point out, there were stipulations, particularly in reference to widows. I guess all of this suggests that this has been an issue from almost the beginning, that it's been a struggle for people. God made us male and female. He made us as sexual beings. And he authorized, again, that the proper place to fulfill those desires was in a marriage. And that marriage was to last forever. But mankind can mess up anything, right? We can mess up everything. And people strayed away from that, going again where men had multiple wives. In Moses' day, men were putting away their wives for any cause. Again, if she burned the biscuits, you've heard that old expression. And Moses tried to handle that and to get them back to realizing that was not something that was pleasing to God. But Jesus, when he looked back, went all the way back. So there have always been marriage issues and marriage problems, it seems. And again, to answer the question, a person was to marry another person that was eligible, somebody that wasn't already married, for example. And man kind of messed all that up. Right. Yeah, and I think he emphasizes. In fact, he says that a man that's married, is looking at the things of his wife, their duties and responsibilities. And you may remember can't remember where the passage is, but the Jews, when somebody got married, they didn't work for a year. The family evidently supported them, and the idea is that you learn to have the kind of relationship that you need to have. So the man and the woman basically had a year to where they spent learning about each other and figuring this thing out before he basically went back to work. So, that being maybe in Paul's mind, Paul being a Jew, knowing that and knowing that, in a family, Paul could not have done what he done if he'd had a wife and kids. There's no way that he could have traveled the way that he traveled. He would have had to have gotten a job somewhere and stayed put in order to do it. So I think you're right. That was the idea that was there. Yes, ma'am. Right. Yep. And within that, there were certain responsibilities and certain duties. And I think you're right. If you remained single, then there were things you couldn't do, things you shouldn't do, things that were sinful. If you were married, there were things you shouldn't do. There were things that were sinful. So there were duties and there were responsibilities both ways. But, Patty's exactly right. Paul was, Paul's an amazing fellow. He obviously was not perfect. No man is. But, when you go back to Acts 9 and he made that commitment, it was 100+%. And he knew what he wanted to do, and he knew that he could not do, certain other things and do that. He talked about Peter's wife and others, and he said, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, you make a good point. Peter likely not only was an apostle, but also one of the elders in the Jerusalem congregation. If you go, I think that's in 1 Peter, right? 1 Peter 3 maybe, where he talks about that. And we know he had a mother-in-law because she was real sick. So, if you get a wife, you get a mother-in-law. Maybe that's why Paul didn't want to get married. He knew he had to have both, one goes with the other. But anyway, the responsibilities were there. But as you point out, God's intention, in fact, what did he tell Adam and Eve? He basically told them to multiply, right? So that's how come me and you are here. It's because they got married and they had children. And you're right, other things were brought into that consideration as well. I don't, maybe somebody has read, it is thought that he was a part of the Sanhedrin court, and I think there was an age there. You had to be so old in order to do that, but I don't know. We do know later that he was an older individual, but that may not have been the way we would look at it as being old. Right. Yeah, and I mean, it's an excellent point. There's something for all of us. There's a place for all of us, and yet there are conditions and restrictions. Men can do things that women cannot do. A single person would be free to do certain things that a married person could not do. But if a person is not married, then there would be things that they would not be qualified to do. But nobody is excluded. Everybody has a duty and everybody has a responsibility. And you're right, it's sort of the beauty of it, you know. But Paul here, it would seem to me, is basically saying, wherever you're at, you know, here is where you need to understand that there's certain duties, there's certain responsibilities. There's things that you should not do. There's things that you can do. And let's sort of jump into that next section, verses 10 through 16. Now to the married, I command yet not I but the Lord. A statement that basically he's saying, you know, the Lord has addressed this. He's going to back up here in a few minutes and basically say, in verse 12, to the rest I, not the Lord. Evidently Jesus had not specifically dealt. Paul is not saying, you know, this is my opinion, because several times he's going to note that he was speaking under the authority of God, the authority of the Holy Spirit. Jesus had addressed some of these things. Paul was addressing some of these things, and he simply emphasizing the difference there. But he says a wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and the husband is not to divorce his wife. I can imagine in Corinth, you know, even as it is today, you know, this was a real issue. Folks were just, you know, separating and divorcing for any crazy reason whatsoever. And a man was leaving a good woman was leaving a good man, just because they wanted to. And so Paul is emphasizing the fact that was not pleasing to God. That there were responsibilities and duties. Marriage was a commitment. And he, in verse 12, deals with where you have a marriage where one is a Christian, one is not. And the difficulties, you know, some of us, we've dealt with that. You know, where your husband or your wife is not a Christian. And it's a challenge within those marriage relationships. But to the rest, not the Lord say, if any brother has a wife, verse 12, who does not believe and she's willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. So he's saying, you know, a Christian is not to divorce a wife just because he's not a believer. That's no reason for that. The flip side of that in verse 13. In verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife. The idea of sanctified is set apart. The idea here is not that because one is a Christian, others are saved, but it's the fact that the potential for that is much greater. And thus they are set apart. God's intention and His desire is that if the husband is a Christian and the wife is not, that his influence will win her over. If she's a Christian, he is not. That influence, that godliness, will lead to his conversion, as well as to the children that may be there as well. Verse 15, but if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage. The word bondage here is used 133 times in the Bible, and it's never used for marriage. Okay, so he's not saying that the marriage is dissolved. What he's saying here is the fact that a Christian does not have to give up their Christianity because of a husband or because of a wife. Our relationship to God must be first, and it's more important than our marriages. So if there is a situation where a husband walks away because the wife says, I'm going to go to church, or she says, I'm committed to God, and that commitment comes before my commitment to you, and then he says, okay, just forget it, and he divorces her. So that idea is what Paul is emphasizing there. In verse 16, he says, for how do you know, a wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, a husband, whether you will save your wife? Their commitment to God, you would hope, would be such a strong influence on that rebellious husband or wife that they would see that commitment, that they would recognize its importance, and that they would turn, and rather than rebel and be a problem, turn away from her or him. Anybody with a thought or comment there in that section? Right. Opinion? Could be. If you look on down to verse 40, still chapter 7, he says that she is happy if she remains as she is according to my judgment, and I think I also have the Spirit of God. So he claimed that, it's just not my opinion. And then over in chapter 14 and verse 37, if anyone thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things which I write to you are the commandments of the Lord. So, could have been. We need to remind ourselves sometimes of the importance of sticking with the book and not giving an opinion. And he wanted them to know that he wasn't giving an opinion, but may very well have been reminding himself. Real quickly as we close here, he's talking about the possibility of marriages ending. There were two options that if that happened. One, they were to remain unmarried, or they were to work out their problems and be reconciled. When he's dealing here with a divorce situation, he's not dealing with the option of, if a husband just walks off and leaves his wife, he's not dealing with the option, one of the options being remarriage. He's emphasizing the fact that you don't give up God. You may not have the marriage you want, but you don't give up God. Appreciate your comments. I didn't want to hear what she was going to say anyway. We'll start right here next week.